everybody, it's Nate Dog here, and today we have another episode of Ted the Caver. Alright, February 13th. It's amazing what a couple good meals and little sleep can do for someone's attitude. Even though we still had memories of the strange noise fresh in our minds, we relit our fire of enthusiasm. The other side of the passage seemed so close. We were sure this would be the day. We got to the cave and we started to work our way down to the hole. Getting back into the darkness of the cave brought back memories of the night before. The side of the circle of rock illuminated by our headlamps, the smell of dirt in the air, and the sound we made as we crawled across the rock. Once we reached the entrance to Floyd's tomb, however, we were once again ready to blaze the trail leading to the undiscovered part of the cave. We immediately noted the presence of a breeze blowing out of the hole and rumbling. The bullpen sticking out of this hole was an obvious sign where we needed to begin work for the day. B took over where he left off the day before. I took up residence in the same spot I occupied the night before. Even though I was already well rested and wanting to start work, B was making the hammer sing with each blow. After a mere 2 or 3 minutes, he let out a cheer. He turned to reveal a handful of rock that used to be attached to the cave. He was breathing heavily, but had a big smile on his face. So did I. For the time, the strange noise had been forgotten, and the vision of success captured our attention. The lower left-hand corner of the hole had been giving us grief because of the thickness of the wall at that point. We felt that if we could just remove that corner, we might be on our way inside. B now held in his hand crumbling remains of the corner. Our excitement consumed us as we examined the hole. I took the hammer and pounded away at the surface of the hole. The idea was to remove the jagged edges that would take their toll on my skin. The size looked right. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for. I cautiously approached the entrance to Floyd's tomb. I decided the best way to enter the small hole was to place one arm over my head, turn my head sideways, and slowly work my way in. I soon determined this was not going to work. The hole was small. If I was going to make it in without widening the hole anymore, I was going to have to put both arms over my head in a diving position, turn my head sideways, and slip into the tomb. The width of the entrance was the limiting factor. The height was sufficient. The arms overhead position flared my shoulder blades out. There was still room to get in. Plus, the arms overhead gave me the best squeeze side to side. In order to enter straight into the hole, I stood on my feet and bent over to get level with the entrance. My knees were bent at a position with uncomfortable sort of semi-squatting position. Bent at the waist with my arms over my head. Plus, I had to slightly turn my upper torso to the left in a counterclockwise rotation and navigate the angle of the entrance. I got my arms through the entrance with minor scraps. Next came my head. By keeping it turned sideways, I was able to fit it in. For the most part, up to my shoulders. When I got to my shoulders, I could feel the rocks touching around all my chest and shoulders. It was not stopping me, but I was definitely scraping many surfaces of my body. I decided to just push through it, keeping in mind that I was going to have to come back out eventually. The pain was not too bad, and I was in. Well, my upper body was in. At least I could get a good idea of what the tomb was going to be like. Once inside the tomb, I had a few inches all around me in which to position my body. This was the largest part of the passage, and it was conveniently located right at the beginning of the crawl. That gave me a little room to get positioned to crawl further into the passage. Inside the tomb gave me a whole new outlook on what it was going to be like to crawl. Even though this was the largest part of the crawl, it was still small. I could move my head around freely, but every direction that I turned, I was staring at a wall of solid rock. When I spoke to B, my voice sounded muffled, like I was talking in a small box. I could rest my chest on the passage floor, but the rocks were uncomfortable. I turned my head to look further ahead, but couldn't see past the wall of rocks I had built the day before. The squeeze toward the end of the passage was closer now, and appeared even more narrow. I didn't know if I could squeeze through it or not. I knew it would be close, but I wanted to crawl further into the passage. First, however, I had to work to get some of the loose rocks that were lying on the passage floor out of my way. I was disappointed to find out that most of the rocks that looked loose were actually attached to the floor. I was hoping to be able to just scrape them out of the way. I had pushed the sledgehammer into the passage before me, so at this point, I used it to push the rock wall we had made further back into the passage. Then I dragged the sledge back and forth across the floor to move any loose rocks or break up the solid ones by sliding the head of the hammer under the squeeze. I determined that the narrowest part of the squeeze was about 7 inches high. I figured we'd have to do some work before I could slip through. The entire time my head in the passage B was just kicking back, listening to my descriptions and progress reports. I slid the sledgehammer as far up as I could reach. Since my body filled the entrance, I could not slip the tool out, so it was easier to push it ahead. In order to rotate my hips to the proper angle to enter the hole, I had to lean my upper body on my forearms, use my feet to climb the wall outside the hole, and slowly crawl into the hole. My hips barely fit. Once they cleared the entrance, I could relax a bit and get into position to work towards the squeeze. I decided to try one arm forward technique to get through the passage. The passage was so narrow that whatever position I started with, I would just have to stay with through the entire length. There was no room to move around or change positions. I would also have to turn my head one way or another and keep it in that same position. This crawl was tight. Moving forward at this part of the passage was relatively easy. I could use my forward arm to pull my other arm to push at the same time. I would wiggle my whole body, trying to arch as much as I could to keep my chest off the rocks. I tried both ways and determined that I would turn my head to the right because it felt most comfortable. I began to learn things as I went. I determined that a small flashlight in one hand would be nice, then I could shine it ahead and get a better idea of what I was about to crawl over. This was a difficult maneuver because I had to look overhead since my head was turned. It became immediately obvious that we were going to have to do some more work removing rocks from the passage floor. As I moved along the surface, I was constantly scraping my chest on the rocks. They were sharp and it was painful. Occasionally I would cause a rock to slide under my chest and actually wedge me between it and the top of the passage. I would then have to back up and either try to move the rock to side with my cheek, using a sweeping motion with my head, or back way out and move it with my forward hand. My little trip in the passage represented a major milestone in my caving career. When I began caving, I did not feel overly comfortable going through tight spaces. Even the little squeeze at the beginning of the cave was an obstacle to overcome. By forcing myself to try the narrow passages, I have become much calmer about tight spaces. Still, this passage represented a new benchmark in small spaces. I had not been faced with anything this small. I don't remember having to take off my helmet before now. With this passage, it is mandatory. As I mentioned before, not only do I have to take off my helmet, but I have to turn my head to the side in order to fit. I went with my left arm forward and head turned to the right. B had given me a flashlight that I had held in my left hand. As I inched forward, I would try to brush loose rocks away with my left arm. This was somewhat successful, but there were a lot of rocks I missed or couldn't move. As I mentioned, the first little bit of the crawl moved along fairly quickly since there was a little more room above me to navigate the passage. Then the wall started to close in around me. I had a few extra inches on either side of me, but the top of the crawl was getting very low. At about the 7-foot mark, I could feel the top rubbing my back as I would arch after another half a foot. I couldn't arch anymore. I had to just push ahead with my toes and pull with my forward arm. I decided it would be a good time to see if I could back out. I tried it, and it was still pretty easy. That gave me a lot more confidence. Still, I had bee tie webbing to my feet just in case he had to pull me out. My neck was starting to get sore from being cranked to the side. My head was getting heavy, but to rest it, the only option I had was to lay it down on the broken rocks. It was painful, but I did it frequently. I was staring at the wall to my right. It was a mere 4 or 5 inches from my face. Most of the time I wasn't watching the wall. Either I had my eyes closed, which I sometimes do when I go through a tight spot, or the light wasn't shining in a direction that did me any good. It was very quiet in the tomb. Other than my own breath, I was breathing heavy from the effort it took to move. Thankfully, the breeze was present and cooled me off. By lifting my head carefully, touching the ceiling from time to time, I could gauge the size of the passage that my body would soon pass through, much like a cat using its whiskers to gauge an opening in a fence. At the 7.5 mark, I could tell things were about to get really tight. While lying in the darkness in a passage deep within a cave, one is in a unique position to ponder. A mountain literally resting on top of me, the entire earth lying below. One tiny movement of the earth and I would cease to exist. Or worse, to recognize the fear shared by Floyd Collins as he lay there, trapped for days deep within the heart of Mother Earth, incapable of freeing himself from his earthen prison. Well, that's pretty much what I was going through at this point in the passage. When I reached the point where my back was rubbing, I could feel with my head the passage was not getting bigger. I knew I was most likely not going to get through. Still, I decided to give one more push. If I had been in this position a year ago, I would have been in a state of panic, but not today. I was pretty pumped. I took a few moments to rest, then I went for it. I exhaled completely, all the air out of my lungs. This caused my chest to collapse enough to scoot forward a few inches. Because it takes so much effort to scoot, I only went a few inches before I had to stop and breathe. As I inhaled, my chest pressed hard against the floor and my back against the top. It took a little longer to get my breath back. Unbelievably, I did it again. Exhale, scoot, rest. Again, only a few inches. Repeat. I took a few extra minutes to enjoy this position, pinned in a small passage. Wow, I could not believe how relaxed I was. I tried one more time to exhale and scoot. My back was rubbing too much to continue. Despite the failed effort, I was psyched. I took several long minutes to lie there and recover from the effort. B had been encouraging me the entire time. It was fun to hear him cheer as he saw my shoes go deeper and deeper into the hole. Backing out was not too difficult, but it did take some work. I encountered the same obstacles as when I went in. After I wiggled my hips out of the hole, which took some time, I had trouble getting my shoulders out. Both arms were overhead at this point. My shirt was getting caught on the rocks and my shoulders were brushing the sharp rocks. After struggling to find a good position, I gave up and just pulled my upper body out. Scrape. My shirt pulled up over my head, and I had some nice scrapes on my shoulders, but I didn't care. To me, this trip was a success. I'd pushed myself beyond what I thought was possible. I kneeled at the entrance and looked into a narrow passage that I'd just been in. The rock wall was now at the 11-foot mark. I had pushed it a little with my forward arm. The smallest point was at the 9-foot mark. We were close between the work and excitement. I was tired. I sat on the rope bag grinning. Whew, what a trip. I remained amazed that we could so easily forget the terrifying moment we experienced just the day before. All had been forgotten, with the strange noise being blamed in our minds on some rational, harmless explanation. April 7th, 2001. Prior to going back to the mystery cave again, we spent a lot of time preparing. We made a squeeze box, which is a wooden box, the opening of which can be adjusted in size. We could then crawl through the opening and measure to see how tight of a squeeze we could fit through. From that, We were able to determine that I need about 8 inches in height to get through the smallest portion of Floyd's tomb. That meant we would have to scrape out about an inch from the floor of the passage. We also learned that the best position I would need to get in through the passage would be on my stomach, with my arms by my side, and of course my head would be turned one way or the other. That position allowed my shoulder blades to drop to the lowest point. In order to move, I would push forward or back with my toes. It sounds difficult, but felt adequate. The second thing we did to prepare was to construct the tools we invented to work with in the cave. I came up with a clever way to chip away the inside of the passage without having to climb inside. I had my neighbor weld together several lengths of pipe in a manner that would allow us to take apart while we were climbing down to the tomb. But we still have the strength necessary to hold up to a blow from a hammer once it was together. We made our own tips that could screw into the pipe to reach the area we needed to work on. B came up with a cool design for a scraper using an angle iron. He had his neighbor weld it together. It proved to be an invaluable tool for scraping and removing the rock. We were proud of our inventions. I also made a device that my drill attached to our pipe. We ended up not using it since B's scraper worked so well. I took an oath. I made a vow. I would not leave the cave until I had made it through that passage, conquered Floyd's tomb. This would be the trip. It had been a long time since we'd been back out to the mystery cave. We had been busy though. We had made the tools, we had talked about it. It was fun coming up with the ideas for our tools. Also, we made a squeeze box to determine the best technique for getting through the tight spot. Plus, we knew about how much rock we needed to remove before we could go through. We were excited to get back down to the cave to finish our project. Our climb down to the passage took a little bit longer than usual since we had extra tools to carry. Once we got down to the passage, we immediately got to work using B's scraper tool with the pipe that I had made. It worked like a charm. We could hammer the pipe on one end and the scraping tool on the other end, dug into the rock. Then we could push the debris all the way through the passage and out of our way. When we needed to measure our progress, we would turn the scraper sideways in the passage to observe the clearance. We worked for 2 hours before I decided to try the tomb. I just wanted to make sure I was going to make it through on the first try. B made one more sweep of the passage floor, clearing any loose rocks from where I would be crawling, and pushing the wall we had made to the back of the squeeze. I had made preparations for the crawl by fastening duct tape suspenders to prevent my shirt from sliding around while sliding across the rock. I went through with a flashlight in my hand, even though my hand would be at my side. I knew I would need it once I got through. As an expression of faith, I did not tie a rope to my feet. I was confident I was going to make it. Finally, I made the attempt. When I could feel my back brushing against the top of the passage in several places, I reverted to my technique of exhaling before I began. However, I took a minute to lay there in the passage. I could see the glow of B's flashlight as the rays of light managed to squeeze past my body. I could feel the cool breeze evaporate the drops of dirty sweat from my forehead. I could feel 1,000 sharp edges dig into the surface of my skin. I felt the twinge of excitement as I realized the goal we had set out to achieve weeks ago was about to be realized. This thought alone made me want to keep moving. No matter how tight the passage became, I breathed in and out rapidly for a few moments, then began. Exhale, scoot, stop to catch my breath, repeat. After just a few inches of scooting, I could raise my head off the floor of the squeeze until the passage was beginning to open up. I relayed this information to B. We both took a few seconds to celebrate. During the rest of the slide through the passage, B was cheering me on. Even though the passage was beginning to get larger, it was still slow going. I had to continue to scoot along for another 1.5 feet before I could slide my arms underneath me and use them to crawl. At that point, I felt my journey was essentially over. I was able to sit up slightly and move the rock wall we had erected several trips ago. Those rocks served as a somber reminder that a little caution would be wise. I shouted back to B. I was through. We both took a minute to congratulate ourselves on our success. B would likely never be able to squeeze through the passage and see what I was seeing, so I gave him a description of the cave, what it looked like at this point. I only had my mini-mag, so I could not see very far into the passage. The end of the passage made a gentle right turn and seemed to go on for some ways. I was unable to do anything at this point but sit. Due to the size of the passage, all of the broken rock we had pushed through Floyd's tomb were around me at this point. There were no other signs of human intrusion. I had to wait until B passed my helmet light to get a better feel for the cave. B used the pole we made to slide me the end of a rope. Then I was able to pull all of my gear through the squeeze. The first thing he sent through was my helmet and light. After I got the light fired up, I was able to see our new section of the cave. Ours. It was an exciting experience to see what results of hours of hard work over the course of several weeks. At this point, we still had no idea what the cave had to offer. The only thing I could see was the passage immediately following the squeeze. It was a narrow passage with a low ceiling. I would easily be able to get through it, but I would have to crawl. I began taking pictures so I could show B. I asked B how far he had thought I should venture into this new cave, in light of strange events that had occurred for the first time. He too toned down the enthusiasm and remembered the noises. He slid the pipe through the tomb and, with a loosened tip on the end, he said I could use it as a weapon if I ran into an animal or... He also told me to make sure we could hear each other as I progressed through the cave. I strapped my gloves and knee pads and grabbed my camera and began my adventure. I crawled through the passage, which was about 20 feet long. At the end of the crawl, the cave bent slightly to the right. I would have to climb up a gentle slope, but then I would be able to stand by the end of the next section of the cave. The next section was about 40 feet long. In addition to having a higher ceiling, the walls were a little wider than the section I had just crawled through. Both sections were relatively straight. The floor was covered in a type of rock which I crunched as I crawled and then walked across it. The walls were basically the same as much of the mystery caves, except pristine. It was obvious no one had been there before me. Upon closer examination of the walls, I found two delicate types of formations. The first resembled several chunks of grated cheese tied together on the end, with the rest of the cheese just flopping down. The second formation was just a tiny strand of rocks, thinner than human hair. It looked pretty cool. I found several examples of both kinds of formations. I was not even through the second section of the cave and I could barely hear B. Caves passages are not acoustically friendly. I shouted to him I would go on for a half hour then return. He said that would be fine and to be careful. I then proceeded to explore some more. I could walk nearly upright at this point. I was on the third straight section of the cave when I discovered a crystal formation on the wall to my right. It was several layers on the wall, resembling a clear candle wax that was allowed to melt and drip down the wall. There were several small, styletic looking formations formed by these crystals. The longest was about 4 inches in length. There would have been one much larger judging by the size of the base, but it had broken off. I looked to see if I could locate where it ended up, but I couldn't find it. The passage continued on for another 100 feet or so before the cave opened up a little. It was at the end of the short, straight segment of the cave. At the very end of the segment, the cave made a bend to the left and opened up into a room. Just at that point where the room began, there was a round rock that appeared leaning against the wall. This seemed odd, but singular formations are common in caves, so it's by no means unique. I've crawled and stepped over several large chunks of rock that fell down from the ceiling, but this one was more than the others. Once past the rock, the room opened up to the height of about 15 feet. It was about 15 feet in width and 30 feet in length. At the far end of the room, there was another passage leading straight out. As I entered the room, I had an eerie feeling. It was like the old saying, that I felt like I was being watched. Once again, the excitement of the newly found area faded, and the memories of the mysterious side of the cave crept back into my mind. Suddenly, I felt very alone. Fortunately for my ego, I was nearly out of time and had to get back before my half hour was up. I took several pictures of the room. I was going to just get a feel for how long the next passage was when something caught my attention. On the left side of the room, on the wall about eye level, I discovered what appeared to be hieroglyphics. It was a single drawing that almost appeared to be just part of the rock coloration. It looked like a very crude representation of people standing below a symbol. I was pumped. This meant that there had to be another entrance to the cave. Even if the entrance was closed or blocked, it might be an opportunity to open it and get B into the cave. I took another look at the drawing to make sure I could describe it to B. Then I took some more pictures and headed back to B. When I got back to the squeeze, I could barely talk fast enough to let B know everything I had discovered. He was just excited to hear about our newly found treasures as we debated what our next move would be. I began to send my gear back through the tomb to B. I told him it would be best if we got someone else to come back with me in case something happened. He agreed. Once I got all my gear through, I was faced with the wonderful task of having to navigate Floyd's tomb again. I determined in advance that I would attempt this first back through the squeeze. I knew I could definitely make it by going feet first, but that would mean backing up all the way through the tomb. That would take a long time and be very exhausting. My only concern in going head first was when I got to the end of the squeeze, I would have to get through the hole we had made without the benefit of being able to twist my body. Oh well, I chose to go head first and deal with the exit when I got it. I started into the squeeze very close to the tight spot, so at least I would have to get it over with sooner. It turned out to be tricky to get through. I had to shift my hips to the right a little to get through, but I just kept plugging away at it. My hands were once again by my side, my head was turned to the right, and I was scooting with my toes. And once again I was using my head to gauge to tell when I was at the tight spot, then when I was past it. I seemed to get tired a little quicker on the way out. Must have been from all the work we had done to get through. I was a little over halfway through when something bizarre happened. I was laying there taking a brief break when I heard a sound deep within the cave. It was faint, but distinct sound of rock sliding on rock. My blood froze in its veins. I couldn't move. I just lay there, straining to hear the sound again. Nothing. I quickly began to scoot towards the exit. I didn't mention the sound of B, but I did recall one of our earlier trips when B said he had heard the same thing. The task of getting out of our hole turned out to be as painful as I thought it would be. I had to put my arms overhead and force my shoulders through the hole. I definitely left some skin behind as I slipped through. B helped me as I wiggled my upper body out of the passage. Then I could catch myself with ease and lower my body out of the tomb. I was out. B and I shook hands and began to load up our gear. I was trying to listen for any sounds coming from the hole. But when we were making way too much noise gathering our stuff. As much as I looked forward to getting back into the passage, it was a relief to get back out. It's pretty much how I feel about all caves in general. I love to go in, but I feel good when I'm able to get back out. Something strange happened with the pictures I took in the new part of the cave. The pictures I took in the passage leading up to the large room all turned out just fine. Strangely, none of the pictures in the room turned out. Pictures of the rock, and more importantly, pictures of the hieroglyphics I saw. Pictures taken before and after the room turned out great, but the negatives of the photos taken in the room were clear. Nothing. I remember what the hieroglyphics looked like, so I drew a picture to give you an idea of what I saw. Alright everybody, well that's it for this episode of Ted the Caver. Alright, so we have confirmed that there was hieroglyphics in the cave. That's very interesting. Now, to figure out what made those hieroglyphics, I'm not sure what exactly to expect because, I mean, if someone was like if you would imagine if a creature was living in there, there would be feces and all kinds of stuff like that. Unless the feces just happen to look like rocks, but also they'd have to be eating, so there'd be bones. So I don't know. So we will see how that goes on the next episode. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys later.